So you go to Harvard in the 70s, and the circle is very interesting. Future Professor Frank Sisson, Orest Subtelny, Zenon Kohut, and in literature, George Grabovich, and in history again, Lubomir Haida, and yourself. Now, 5 of the 6 are historians, Professor Grabovich in literature. Professor Haida will stay at Harvard, at the Institute, essentially for the rest of his life, and everyone else will migrate to Canada. This was the formative, first generation form in an institutional, that is, Ukrainian studies institutional context. Of course, you had people earlier, such as, Pritsak was not really, he wasn't, but Reshetar, Professor Reshetar, Dmitrishin, professor from
Shevelov in Colombia,
Pfizer, not Biletsky, but
Bilenki. No, is it Bilenki? Delaware. He was from Delaware.
Delaware.
Who wrote that excellent book, actually.
So of course you had a first generation, but they were all isolated in their departments.
Correct.
This was the first cohort.
Correct.
A product of a Ukrainian Studies Institute, and pretty much most, if not all of them, applied and ended up on the short list towards the creation of the chair of Ukrainian Studies at the University of Toronto. And the position was given to you 39 years ago. In your recollections on becoming a Ukrainianist, you only mentioned that in passing. That is the reason of the controversy, because it's been discussed. You've written about it elsewhere and at great length. The short story is, with some important exceptions, you had the organized Ukrainian-Canadian and probably Ukrainian-American community, but particularly Canadian because that was now the first chair in Canada, on the barricades against you, trying to prevent you from getting the position at University of Toronto. And the simple question for our international audience here is why? Why was it so controversial? And there was a durability to the controversy. It didn't peter out. It actually lasted for a very long time in your career. What was the problem?
This is the world of academic politics. All of you sitting in this room, probably a good percentage, a very high percentage of people sitting in this room are associated with academic institutions. And we know in general that academic politics are so brutal because the stakes are so low. Because the only stakes there are is one's personal hubris and alleged pride. It's not money. If it were money, as in the business world, it would get resolved real quickly because we have to move on and make more money. But academics can just, be angry at each other for years after and angry at institutions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So in that world of academic politics, I came late into this equation at the University of Toronto. It had started a year before with Subtelny being a visiting professor, and then they had all the interviews in 1979. I was the last one. Literally, I was an add-on in January, I think, of 1980. By that time, there was already a very pronounced controversy between the members of the search committee, and in particular, let's be very blank and very easy and quick, Slavic departments in the United States in particular, and also in Canada, were made up of people, many people, who did not have academic credentials. Why was this the case? That's because after World War II, when the Cold War began, the United States decided that it has to study and know about these countries behind the Iron Curtain, most particular the Soviet Union and most particular trained Russian specialists. And where were they going to get these people? So this was the era by the 50s and certainly the early 50s, when you had this large number of DPs, and many of these DPs got jobs as librarians and as instructors in language in Slavic departments, just because they knew the language. They may have never even studied the language formally or published anything, but they knew the language. We needed language teachers at that time. And so they get into these departments, and they are now ensconced. They're not going to give up a job. And the other area where there were a lot of these such people were in libraries. Right? And among these people were Ukrainians. Many of those Ukrainians had to teach Russian, by the way, because otherwise they couldn't have a job. But nonetheless, they did it. But with no academic training, many of them didn't have PhDs. And so these people are now senior members of departments by the 1970s and 1980s, and they are treating their departments as if the way they were treated. Oh, we need somebody, he looks good, we like him, we take him. So what happened, and this is just like an insight into academic politics, what happened here was the leading figure, the only Ukrainianist on the search committee for the chair of Ukrainian studies was someone who was opposed to the whole idea of having a chair of Ukrainian studies created in the first place.
Why was that?
Because he thought that it was unnecessary. And that was Professor George Lutsky of the Slavic Languages Department. Because this was a community initiative, and when the businessmen who raised the money to get matched by the federal government, they went to whom? Their only reputable Ukrainianist at the University of Toronto, which was him, and he said, no, we don't need a chair, you guys shouldn't be doing it. Of course, these young Ukrainian businessmen, they didn't care, and they went out and got the money, and they got the money from match from the government, and then they come back to the university, and then he gets put on the committee. Within 3 months, he resigns from the committee in protest, critical of the University of Toronto because it's being unfair. Why? Because he came from the Slavic department. He and his friends had already decided who should be holder of the chair. It was decided, just like in the late 50s and 60s when many of them got hired. And their candidate, however, the problem is this mini Slavic department, this mini ghetto, is now dealing with the two largest departments at the University of Toronto with some influence and with some standards. And that was the Department of Political Science and the Department of History. And he comes to this committee and says, well, we already have a candidate. And they went berserk. What? We don't have a search. We have to go through procedure. I mean, we have an international, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that began the first controversy. He then resigns in protest, and then he turns and he pretends that he is the defender of the Ukrainian community against this big bully, the University of Toronto, who is not hiring whom he wants and is going to go through. So that's how that began. I didn't even exist at this point. Then when I came onto the scene, that only added fuel to their fire.
All hell broke loose.
Well, yeah, it added fuel to their fire because I'm not a Ukrainianist, or I don't like Ukrainians, and most importantly, I support the idea that one portion of Ukraine or one people living in Ukraine are not Ukrainians, and therefore
That's the key, isn't it?
Well,
that was the fundamental.
Yeah, it's the worst of worst. Someone who doesn't, from their perspective, recognize their own identity. And by the way, my mother was born in present-day Ukraine. I can get a Ukrainian passport, not like Frank Sisson or some of my other colleagues. And my mother's native village is, to this day, not even anymore Carpato-Russian speaking, alas. Well, they still do it. But Ukrainian speaking, and they identify as Ukrainians. Well, this is Transcarpathia. Not all of them do, but in this village they do. So, I come from that world, or my mother comes from that world, and all my maternal parents come from that world.